You've probably heard this idea before, or at least seen it floating around online. The idea that Wakanda, the fictional nation from Black Panther, is supposed to represent Africa, but in a better version. A version that was never colonized, never exploited, never held back. A version that had the chance to become something powerful, advanced, and untouched. And at first glance, that idea feels right. It feels meaningful. It feels like one of those interpretations that adds depth to the story and gives it a kind of historical weight. But the more you think about it, the more that idea starts to fall apart. Not because Wakanda has nothing to do with Africa, but because people misunderstand the relationship between the two. Wakanda was never meant to be a real projection of Africa. Not historically, not culturally, and not even symbolically in the way people often describe it. And once you realize that, it doesn't make the story weaker. It actually makes it more interesting. Because the first mistake people make is treating Africa like it's one single thing, one culture, one identity, one history that can be summed up and represented by a single fictional country. But Africa doesn't work like that. It never has. It's a continent made up of dozens of countries, hundreds of cultures, and thousands of languages, each with its own history, its own traditions, and its own way of existing in the world. So the idea that Wakanda could somehow stand in for all of that, it was never realistic to begin with. And more importantly, it was never the intention behind its creation. Wakanda isn't Africa. It's not even trying to be Africa. What it actually is something much more abstract. It's a remix, a construction, a kind of imagined world built from inspiration rather than representation. When you look at Wakanda, you're not looking at a real place translated into fiction. You're looking at pieces of different cultures, different aesthetics, different ideas, all brought together into something new. The clothing draws from multiple regions. The architecture blends traditional elements with futuristic design. Even the language is rooted in real influences, but placed into a completely fictional context. It's not meant to be accurate. It's meant to feel cohesive. And that's where the confusion starts. Because people often mistake inspiration for representation. Just because something takes inspiration from real cultures doesn't mean it's trying to represent them faithfully. And Wakanda doesn't operate like a representation. It operates like a creative interpretation. It takes elements that exist in the real world and rearranges them into something that fits the story it wants to tell. Almost like a what-if scenario, but not in a historical sense. More like a conceptual one. That becomes even clearer when you look at the most popular interpretation of Wakanda, which is the idea that it represents Africa without colonization. This idea is everywhere. It's repeated so often that it almost feels like an official explanation. But if you actually look at Wakanda as a society, that interpretation doesn't really hold up. Because Wakanda isn't just a place that avoided colonization. It's a place that had access to something completely unrealistic: vibranium. A resource so powerful that it doesn't just give Wakanda an advantage, it completely changes the rules of what's possible. And that's important, because it means Wakanda isn't operating under normal historical conditions. It's not just Africa left alone to develop naturally. It's a version of Africa that was given an impossible advantage from the start. Advanced technology, medical breakthroughs, energy systems that don't exist in the real world, all of that comes from something fictional. So when people say Wakanda is what Africa could have been, they're ignoring the fact that Wakanda's development is based on something that never existed. It's not an alternate history. It's a fantasy built on altered rules. And once you remove that misunderstanding, you start to see the story differently, because Wakanda isn't trying to answer the question of what Africa would look like under different historical circumstances. It's trying to explore something else entirely, something more personal, more internal, and more focused on identity than geography. You can see that clearly in the conflict between T'Challa and Killmonger. On the surface, their conflict looks political. It looks like a disagreement about leadership, about power, about what Wakanda should do with its resources. But underneath that, it's really about two completely different experiences of identity. T'Challa grows up inside Wakanda, protected, connected to his heritage, surrounded by a culture that was never disrupted. Killmonger grows up outside of it, disconnected, shaped by a completely different reality, one that involves struggle, displacement, and anger. So the conflict between them isn't really about Africa versus the world. It's about what happens when two people share the same roots, but grow up in completely different environments. One sees Wakanda as something to protect. The other sees it as something that should have done more. And that tension has nothing to do with representing a continent. It has everything to do with belonging, responsibility, and perspective. And this is where the idea of Wakanda being Africa becomes limiting, because it reduces a complex story into a simple metaphor. It turns something that's about identity into something that's about geography. And in doing that, it kind of misses the point. Wakanda isn't trying to show you what Africa is. It's trying to explore what identity looks like when it's preserved versus when it's disrupted, when it's protected versus when it's lost and rediscovered in a different form. That's why Wakanda works better as a symbol than as a representation. It's not meant to be realistic. It's not meant to be accurate. It's meant to create a space where certain ideas can be explored without being tied down by real-world limitations. It represents pride, heritage, strength, but also isolation, hesitation, and the consequences of staying hidden while the rest of the world struggles. And maybe that's the real reason why people connect to it the way they do. Not because it's a perfect version of Africa, but because it's a version of something that feels powerful, untouched, and in control of its own narrative. It's not about what Africa is or could have been. It's about what people imagine when they think about identity without interference. So when people say Wakanda represents Africa, they're not completely wrong, but they're not entirely right either. Because Wakanda doesn't represent Africa in a literal sense. It represents an idea inspired by it, an idea that takes elements of real cultures and builds something new with them. Something that isn't meant to replace reality, but to exist alongside it as a kind of reflection. And once you see it that way, the question changes. It's no longer about whether Wakanda is an accurate depiction of Africa. It's about what the story is actually trying to say through it, what it chooses to highlight, what it chooses to ignore, and what it allows itself to imagine. Because at the end of the day, Wakanda isn't real. It doesn't follow real rules, it doesn't reflect real history, and it doesn't try to. And that's exactly why it works. Not as a representation, but as a concept. Not as a projection of reality, but as a space where ideas can be pushed further than they normally could. So no, Wakanda was never meant to represent Africa. It was meant to be something else entirely. Something inspired by it, shaped by it, but ultimately separate from it. And understanding that doesn't take anything away from the story. If anything, it makes it clearer. Because once you stop looking at Wakanda as a place, you start seeing it for what it really is, an idea. And that changes everything. If you enjoy breaking down stories like this, looking past what they seem to be and getting into what they actually are, then that's exactly what this channel is about. This is Shake the Lore, and sometimes the story behind the story is the one that matters most.